The Senate chamber was electric, a sea of polished wood and glaring lights, every seat filled, every camera pointed at the same tense exchange. Reporters leaned forward, pens frozen in midair, as murmurs rippled through the crowd like distant thunder. At the center of it all sat Senator Tommy Tuberville, reclining with the ease of a man who believed himself untouchable. A smirk curled on his lips, and then came the laugh, a sharp, dismissive chuckle that cut through the hushed room. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat upright, calm as still water, her eyes steady and unbothered. Her hands rested neatly on the table, a quiet display of composure in a room crackling with tension. The cameras flashed again and again, capturing Tuberville's sneer, her poise, the charged stillness between them. Laughter echoed through the chamber, but it wasn't the warm kind. It was sharp and hollow, bouncing off the marble walls like an insult too loud to ignore. Viewers at home shifted in their seats, a collective discomfort settling over them. Something about the moment felt wrong, as if history itself bristled at the sound. Crockett's gaze didn't waver. Her expression was a portrait of quiet strength, a stark contrast to Tuberville's arrogance. The tension deepened as whispers swept through the rows of staffers and press. They could sense it, that something was building. This wasn't just another political skirmish destined to be forgotten. This was the kind of confrontation that burns its way into headlines, that etches itself into memory. And then, slowly, she moved her hand to the stack of papers before her, fingers grazing a single envelope tucked neatly among them. For a split second, the smirk on Tuberville's face faltered, just enough for the cameras to catch it. No one in that chamber knew what was coming. They didn't know that within that envelope lay a voice from another time, a letter carried through decades of sacrifice and silence, a story powerful enough to strip the smugness from even the boldest critic. But this wasn't just a moment. This was decades of history colliding in one room, and the world was about to witness it unfold. The air in the Senate hearing room was heavy with anticipation, attention sharpened by months of political brinkmanship and endless headlines. This wasn't just another committee meeting. The stakes were enormous. Policies that would ripple through every corner of the country, debates that would determine who truly held power. The cameras circling the chamber weren't just capturing soundbites, they were documenting a battle emblematic of an America at war with itself. Every viewer watching live knew they were seeing more than legislation discussed, they were witnessing a clash of values, a test of character in real time. Tommy Tuberville's reputation preceded him, and the smirk on his face wasn't a surprise to anyone who had followed his career. A former football coach turned senator, he'd built his brand on defiance and showmanship, wielding controversy as if it were a badge of honor. His comments often sparked outrage, his disregard for Senate norms a source of both fascination and frustration. Tuberville relished confrontation, leaning into his outsider persona, and tonight he was in his element, laughing openly in a room where dignity was meant to reign. It was theater for him, and he played his role with smug precision. But across the table sat Jasmine Crockett, whose quiet composure seemed almost out of place in such a hostile environment. Her poise wasn't for show, it was the product of years of battles fought with reason, law, and grit. She didn't match Tuberville's arrogance with anger. Instead, she wielded calm like a weapon, the stillness of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and learned to let others' arrogance write their own downfall. To many in the room, she was just another nameplate at the hearing. They didn't yet see the storm she carried with her. The hearing unfolded like a slow-burn drama. Questions were exchanged, tempers flared, and every word seemed to drip with the weight of political theater. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing a shift in tone that couldn't yet be explained. Clips from the chamber were already making their way to social media, snippets of Tuberville's dismissive laugh being replayed and dissected by an audience hungry for meaning. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness a moment that would define careers and spark conversations far beyond Capitol Hill. Crockett remained measured, her eyes scanning her notes, her demeanor unwavering as Tuberville chuckled in her direction. She wasn't rattled. If anything, her calm was unsettling to those around her, a stark counterpoint to the bravado on display. There was an unspoken energy radiating from her, the quiet confidence of someone who knew she had something far more powerful than a sharp retort or a viral one-liner. The room shifted ever so slightly, as if everyone sensed a turning point approaching. Even those who had tuned in casually, scrolling their phones between questions, were now transfixed. Something in Crockett's stillness hinted that this hearing would not be remembered for Tuberville's laugh but for what followed it. Viewers across the country leaned in, not knowing this was about to become historic. This wasn't just politics as usual. This was the kind of confrontation that rewrites narratives, that forces the powerful to reckon with truths they can't laugh away. To understand the weight of this clash, you need to know the man laughing, and the woman he underestimated. Before he was a senator, Tommy Tuberville was a household name in an entirely different arena. For decades, he roamed football sidelines with a whistle around his neck and a headset pressed tight, commanding locker rooms and dominating press conferences. He was the embodiment of a tough-talking coach, revered by fans for his victories and swagger. But when he traded the roar of stadiums for the marble halls of Washington, that swagger didn't fade, it amplified. Tuberville arrived in the Senate with the same bravado he once displayed on game day, but here, the stakes weren't trophies. They were lives, livelihoods, and the very integrity of democracy. He leaned into his outsider persona, branding himself as a man unafraid to break tradition, to mock the establishment, and to relish controversy. Supporters called him bold, but his critics saw something darker, a disdain for norms, for compromise, for the respect that politics demands when decisions shape a nation. Tuberville didn't just reject the Senate's culture of decorum. He weaponized it, turning procedural maneuvers into stunts, holding military promotions hostage to score political points, and making headlines more for obstruction than leadership. Clips of him dismissing opponents circulated widely. "I don't care what they think," he once scoffed when asked about bipartisan criticism. His tone was casual, as if arrogance was a second language. Another moment went viral when he brushed off questions about the chaos caused by his legislative tactics, saying, "It's not my problem if they don't like it." These weren't mere gaffes. They were glimpses of a man who saw politics as a battlefield, not a place of service. For Tuberville, laughing at an opponent wasn't just instinct, it was strategy. He had spent years perfecting the art of belittlement, of projecting dominance with a smirk and a shrug. It was a performance, and in an era where sound bites carried more weight than substance, he thrived. His critics argued that behind the jokes and quips was a hollow understanding of governance, a man who played politics like a game, oblivious to the lives impacted by his choices. Yet Tuberville's arrogance wasn't just about personality, it symbolized something larger. He became a face of a political elite that mocked sacrifice, that treated service and struggle as bargaining chips rather than sacred values. His disdain for military promotions wasn't a minor procedural issue, it was a calculated flex of power that left families in limbo, service members stuck in uncertainty while he delivered speeches and interviews about principle. Veterans groups and military families condemned him, but Tuberville doubled down, confident that his political base would reward defiance over dignity. He carried himself like a man untouchable, a man who believed experience on the football field was proof enough of his leadership. And in many ways, it worked. His refusal to bend made him a darling of certain corners of the political world, but to others, he became a symbol of something corrosive, a politics stripped of humility, of reverence, of the empathy that comes from understanding sacrifice. The laughter that rang out in that Senate chamber wasn't a one-off reaction. It was the culmination of years of arrogance, a reflection of a man who had grown so accustomed to wielding power through mockery that he couldn't recognize the gravity of the moment. To him, this was just another opponent, another debate, another chance to display dominance. But there was a disconnect, a blind spot that would soon become painfully obvious. Tuberville didn't see the weight Crockett carried into that room, the quiet strength forged through her own family's story. He didn't understand that some battles aren't about winning headlines but honoring truths that transcend politics. The cameras captured his smirk, his laugh, his dismissive body language. To millions watching, that laugh echoed as a symbol of everything they resented. Politicians who treated governance like theater, who saw courage as weakness and mockery as strength. Yet arrogance has a way of blinding people, especially to the power of truth. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that Senate hearing with bravado or theatrics. She walked in carrying the quiet weight of a life shaped by struggle, sacrifice, and relentless perseverance. Long before the cameras and the marble floors, there was a little girl growing up in a modest home, watching her parents work tirelessly to provide opportunities they never had themselves. Hers was not a life of privilege. It was one built brick by brick, day by day, with lessons that would shape the woman now sitting calmly across from one of Washington's most arrogant senators. Her father was a Vietnam veteran, a man who rarely spoke of the war, but whose silence told stories louder than words ever could. The neatly folded flag in the corner of their living room was more than decoration. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of nights spent far from home, and of battles fought in both foreign jungles and within his own memories. He carried his service with humility, never asking for recognition, never boasting. To Jasmine, he was living proof that courage didn't always roar, it often spoke softly, through steady hands and unshakable integrity. From a young age, Jasmine absorbed those values. She learned that strength wasn't about how loudly you spoke but how firmly you stood. She watched her father rise early every morning, his movements deliberate, his discipline unwavering, and her mother balancing the weight of a household while supporting a husband who carried invisible scars. That quiet heroism became the foundation of her character, guiding her through every obstacle she would face. School wasn't easy. She worked harder than most, often balancing studies with jobs to help her family make ends meet. Teachers saw her drive and ambition, but few understood the fire behind it, a daughter determined to honor the sacrifices made before her, to carve out a life that reflected the dignity her father carried even in silence. Law school followed, a grueling chapter that tested her resolve but also sharpened her purpose. Jasmine wasn't drawn to the law for prestige or power, she was drawn to it as a tool to fight for people who, like her family, knew what it meant to be overlooked. Her legal career became a testament to her grit. She took on cases others avoided, representing clients who didn't have deep pockets or political connections. She fought for justice in courtrooms where she was often underestimated, her calm demeanor masking a razor-sharp intellect. She built a reputation for being relentless yet measured, the kind of advocate who didn't need to raise her voice to command respect. In every victory, she carried the lessons of her upbringing, that true power lies not in intimidation, but in steadfastness. But her greatest source of strength came not from her achievements, but from the story she carried with her, the history of a father who served his country even when that country didn't always serve him back. His Vietnam service was more than a chapter in his life, it was a thread woven into Jasmine's identity. She grew up with a deep understanding of sacrifice, not from textbooks or speeches, but from the quiet resilience of a man who'd faced death and returned home forever changed. That perspective shaped how she approached politics. To Jasmine, service wasn't about grandstanding or applause. It was about honoring the countless acts of courage and selflessness performed by people like her father, who never sought recognition. She entered public life not to chase power but to ensure that dignity, sacrifice, and justice would never be mocked or forgotten. And that's why, when she stepped into the Senate chamber that day, her calm was unshakable. She wasn't just a congresswoman facing a dismissive senator, she was a daughter carrying the legacy of a soldier, a man whose handwritten letter had survived decades, tucked carefully away like a relic of history. Tuberville saw only a political opponent. He didn't see the gravity she brought into that room, the quiet force that comes from knowing your voice carries more than just your own story. She had come prepared, not with rehearsed sound bites or theatrics, but with a single envelope that held the words of a man who had sacrificed everything for a nation he believed in. Those words weren't meant for political theater, they were a reminder of what true service looks like, a mirror she would soon hold up to the arrogance across the table. What Tuberville didn't know was that she had brought a piece of history with her. A letter that carried the weight of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. A letter that would cut through laughter like a blade and remind every person in that chamber of the true meaning of patriotism. The clash wasn't just political, it was personal. The chamber was thick with tension, every sound amplified by the silence that followed Tuberville's latest quip. His laugh lingered, sharp and dismissive, as if the exchange before him was little more than sport. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing the smug grin of a man confident that the cameras were on his side. Reporters scribbled furiously, lenses zoomed in on his expression, and whispers rippled through the room like static. Jasmine Crockett remained still. Her composure was unnerving to those who expected her to rise to the bait. Instead of bristling, she tilted her head slightly, eyes steady, and offered a measured reply. Her voice was calm but carried a weight that made even the most seasoned journalists glance up from their notes. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her words were deliberate, carefully chosen, and laced with quiet authority. Tuberville chuckled again, louder this time, glancing at his colleagues as if searching for approval. A few smirked along with him, but their laughter felt forced, brittle under the glare of the cameras. Crockett, unshaken, delivered another sharp yet composed response, and this time the laughter didn't follow. Instead, a murmur spread across the gallery. Viewers in the room could feel a shift, like the atmosphere tightening around them. The back and forth continued, but Crockett never broke her rhythm. She spoke with the precision of a litigator, weaving facts and principle into every sentence, her calm demeanor cutting sharper than anger ever could. Each time Tuberville tried to undercut her, she met him with patience that seemed almost disarming, forcing him into a rhythm he couldn't control. Photographers captured every moment, his smirk, her composure, the slow burn of frustration creeping into his posture. The sound of camera shutters clicking became a drumbeat in the background, each snap immortalizing the growing imbalance of power in the room. As the exchange wore on, whispers in the press gallery turned into soft gasps. Those watching at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing something remarkable unfolding. Crockett wasn't just holding her ground, she was shifting the energy of the entire hearing, turning Tuberville's mockery into a stage for something far greater. Then, in one fluid motion, she reached into her folder. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to draw every eye in the chamber. Tuberville's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, his confidence flickering under the weight of her unspoken intention. She pulled out a single envelope, worn at the edges, and placed it gently on the table in front of her. The whispers stopped. Reporters froze, pens hovering above notebooks. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath as Crockett rested her hand on the envelope, her gaze steady on Tuberville. There was no need for theatrics. The silence was theater enough. This wasn't just another debate. This was something heavier, deeper. The weight of history was suddenly present in the room, carried in that single piece of paper that looked unremarkable but felt like it held generations within it. Crockett's fingers tapped lightly against the envelope, the only sound breaking the stillness. Tuberville shifted in his seat, and for the first time since the exchange began, there was no laugh, no quip, no smirk. Just a flicker of unease as he realized this moment wasn't going to follow his script. Crockett looked up, her calm gaze sweeping the chamber, before she spoke again, her voice low, deliberate, and steady enough to send a shiver through the room. What happened next froze the entire chamber. Crockett's fingers slid under the flap of the envelope, and the sound of paper brushing against paper filled the silence. It was a simple sound, but in the charged stillness of that chamber, it rang louder than any gavel. She drew out the letter with a reverence that made the moment feel sacred. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if she knew every second was being watched, every breath broadcast to millions. She unfolded the creased paper carefully, smoothing its edges as her eyes scanned the familiar handwriting. When she looked up, her expression was unreadable, but the energy in the room shifted entirely. Tuberville leaned back, his smirk faltering, his arms no longer crossed with the same confidence. Cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of expression, every tremor in the air. "My father wrote this letter in 1969, she began, her voice steady but soft, forcing the room to lean in. He was 21 years old, serving in a country he'd never seen before, fighting a war he didn't fully understand. He sent this home to his parents. They kept it folded and worn from being read so many times. And now, I want to read it here." No one moved. The sound of Crockett's voice filled the chamber as she began. "Dear Mom and Dad, I don't know how to put into words what this place is like. The nights here are louder than the days, full of gunfire and whispers of men I don't know calling for help. I keep thinking about home, about the smell of your cooking and the sound of Dad's old radio. Those memories are what keep me going. I'm not afraid to fight, but I won't lie, I'm afraid I won't make it back. I see boys younger than me who don't even have pictures in their pockets because they're too poor to have family photos. I try to keep them laughing, even when I'm scared myself. I've seen men give their lives for one another without hesitation. I've seen bravery that humbles me every day. I've learned that courage isn't about feeling safe, it's about standing your ground even when you're terrified. I don't know if this letter will reach you, but if it does, please know I'm proud to wear this uniform. Even when I'm angry, even when I feel forgotten, I still believe this country is worth fighting for. I hope when I come home, I can tell you all this myself. If I don't, just know I went down fighting for something bigger than me." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw, the weight of a soldier's fear and courage settling over the room. Crockett's voice didn't tremble, but the emotion behind it was palpable, like a current running beneath every syllable. She paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch, giving those words the reverence they deserved. Tuberville's smirk was gone. He shifted in his seat, eyes darting briefly toward the cameras, then back to Crockett, as if searching for a script that no longer existed. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The laughter that once echoed in the room was now replaced by an almost unbearable stillness. Crockett continued, her tone firm but filled with quiet sorrow. "My father survived Vietnam. But he didn't come home unchanged. He carried scars, both seen and unseen, for the rest of his life. He believed in serving this country even when that country didn't always serve him back. And I sit here today as his daughter, Not because I want power, not because I want headlines, but because he taught me that service is sacred. That sacrifice is not a punchline. The chamber was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning and the rustle of papers as a few senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reporters who had come prepared for another partisan spectacle now found themselves gripping their pens tighter, their notes forgotten. Crockett raised the letter slightly, her eyes never leaving Tuberville. This isn't just paper. These are the words of a young black soldier who risked everything for a nation that wasn't perfect, but one he still believed in. My father wrote these words before most of us in this room were even born. And yet, here we are, laughing at sacrifice. A collective shiver rippled through the audience gallery. Tuberville's face flushed, the once confident tilt of his shoulders now stiff. The cameras captured it all, the man who had mocked and sneered now sitting in silence, while a daughter's voice carried the weight of history. It wasn't just a letter, she said, her voice rising slightly, not in anger, but in strength. It was a mirror. A mirror held up to every person who dares to dismiss the sacrifices that make their power possible. This letter is a reminder that there are graves across this world filled with men and women who didn't laugh when called to serve. They didn't mock or sneer. They stood up and fought. And some never came home. The words echoed like a bell tolling through the chamber. Crockett's calm was unshaken, her delivery more powerful than shouting could ever be. The gravity of her father's story filled every corner of the room, pressing on those who had walked into this hearing ready to spar but now found themselves silent, reflective. Tuberville swallowed hard, his usual bravado gone. His hands rested stiffly on the table, his eyes cast downward for a fleeting second, betraying a crack in the armor he wore so proudly. The cameras caught everything, the unraveling of a man who had walked into the chamber laughing, only to be silenced by the voice of history itself. Crockett folded the letter slowly, her fingers smoothing the creases as if honoring her father's memory with every deliberate motion. The sound of the paper folding was sharp in the silence, a quiet punctuation to words that would linger long after she placed the letter back in its envelope. She looked up once more, her expression steady, unflinching. So when you laugh, she said softly, remember this. There are families across this country who have given everything so you can sit here and laugh. But their sacrifices deserve better than mockery. They deserve respect. The silence in the chamber was absolute. No one moved. Even the cameras seemed hesitant to pan away, transfixed by the weight of the moment. Crockett's words had transformed the room, stripping away politics and leaving only truth. And the ripple effect started before she even folded the paper. The moment the hearing ended, the footage exploded across the internet like a spark hitting dry tinder. Clips of Tuberville's smug laugh, followed by Crockett's calm delivery of her father's Vietnam letter, flooded social media within minutes. The hashtags began trending almost immediately. Hashtag letter from Vietnam. Hashtag respect sacrifice. Hashtag Crockett mic drop. People who hadn't watched a Senate hearing in years suddenly found themselves transfixed, replaying the clip over and over, stunned by the rawness of the exchange. The laughter that had once echoed in that chamber now echoed online, but not in Tuberville's favor. Memes circulated, contrasting his smirk with Crockett's unwavering expression, turning the senator's bravado into a symbol of tone-deaf arrogance. One viral tweet read, "She didn't just shut him down. She reminded us all what service actually means." Another paired Crockett's poised reading of the letter with a still image of her father in uniform, a tribute that garnered hundreds of thousands of retweets. Veterans organizations weighed in quickly. The Veterans of Foreign Wars issued a statement praising Crockett for bringing humanity back into a conversation that too often forgets the cost of freedom. A retired Marine Corps general shared the clip on his personal account, writing, "Every senator should be required to hear this letter. This is the reality of sacrifice. This is patriotism." Journalists, too, couldn't stop talking about it. Major outlets ran headlines that read like movie trailers. Crockett silences the chamber with a Vietnam veteran's letter, and Tuberville's laughter fades as history speaks. Analysts debated the political fallout, noting that Tuberville's posture of defiance had finally backfired, not because of clever talking points or heated arguments, but because of something far more powerful, a handwritten letter that captured the human cost of politics. Late-night hosts dedicated entire monologues to the moment, replaying Crockett's reading with reverence and contrasting it with Tuberville's awkward silence. One host quipped, "That's the sound of arrogance meeting reality," before turning serious, reflecting on the letter's contents and the families who'd lived that truth. On TikTok, Gen Z users created video edits of Crockett's speech layered with emotional music, the kind of content that turned political moments into cultural events. Young viewers who rarely engaged with politics shared the video widely, praising Crockett not just for her words but for her composure. "This is how you fight hate, with truth," one comment read, earning tens of thousands of likes. Tuberville, for his part, tried to deflect in brief interviews, but his words rang hollow. Every attempt to downplay the moment only reignited anger. Headlines began to focus not only on Crockett's courage but on his dismissiveness of veterans' sacrifices. The senator's team stayed silent for much of the following day, perhaps recognizing that no statement could undo the image of him sitting wordless in the chamber as Crockett folded her father's letter with deliberate care. For Crockett, the reaction was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from across the country. Letters from veterans' families, calls from advocacy groups, and emails from parents telling her that her words had inspired their children to ask questions about service and history. One Vietnam veteran wrote, "I watched your speech with tears in my eyes. I saw myself in your father's words. Thank you for giving him a voice in that room." The ripple effect reached far beyond politics. Memorial walls and museums reported surges in visitors in the weeks that followed, as families sought to reconnect with stories of service and sacrifice. Teachers shared Crockett's speech with their students, using it as a lesson not just in civics, but in empathy. In the halls of Congress, the tone shifted too. While partisanship remained, Crockett's moment cut through the noise, a reminder that power carries weight and that arrogance has consequences. Even some of Tuberville's allies avoided defending him, choosing instead to quietly praise Crockett's dignity. Her words became a rallying cry. "Respect sacrifice" trended for days, turning into more than a hashtag. It became a sentiment, a demand from a public tired of performative politics and hungry for leaders who carried themselves with humility. Crockett's composure, her ability to silence a room not with anger but with truth, became an emblem of what leadership should look like. And yet, as powerful as the reaction was, Crockett didn't treat it like a victory lap. She understood the gravity of the moment. The letter wasn't just a political tool, it was her father's story, one of countless sacrifices made quietly, without applause. She had shared it not for headlines but for a deeper purpose, to remind the nation of its debt to those who serve. The country watched her rise from that hearing table with quiet strength, and for a moment, politics felt human again. Millions of viewers felt a sense of validation, pride swelling in the face of arrogance finally humbled. The viral clip wasn't just entertainment, it was a mirror, reflecting back values that had been buried beneath partisanship for too long. But Crockett wasn't done. Her message wasn't just for one senator, it was for all of America. When the dust settled and the cameras replayed that hearing from every angle, what stood out wasn't the confrontation, the laughter, or even the stunned silence, it was the lesson that emerged from it. Jasmine Crockett's words transcended the politics of the day, reaching beyond party lines, beyond partisanship, and touching something deeper, a reminder of what service truly means. She took the mocking laughter of a senator and transformed it into a moment of reverence, not for herself, but for every family that has ever folded a flag over a loved one's casket, for every veteran who carried scars long after the battlefield faded from view. In interviews that followed, Crockett spoke not of victory but of gratitude. She reminded America that her father's story wasn't unique. He was one of thousands, she said softly, who gave more than they ever got in return. And they did it because they believed in something bigger than themselves. Her voice was calm, but her words struck a chord across the country. Veterans groups played the clip at events. Families of soldiers wrote letters thanking her for saying what they'd felt for years but never heard spoken in the halls of power. Crockett reframed the moment entirely. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about remembrance. She turned the spotlight away from the mockery and onto the sacrifices that had been diminished. Service, she told reporters, is not measured in titles or wealth, but in sacrifice. It is the courage to give more than you think you have, to stand for a country even when that country struggles to stand for you. The viral footage was edited into montages that swept across social media. Crockett's steady hands unfolding the letter, her father's black and white Vietnam photo fading in, then images of soldiers marching home, families waiting with tear-streaked faces, Arlington Road stretching into the horizon. Music swelled behind her words, and for once, politics felt secondary to principle. People weren't just watching a political showdown, they were reminded of the humanity behind the laws, the votes, and the debates. At community gatherings, veterans played the clip aloud, some wiping tears as Crockett's voice carried over their stories. Teachers showed the video in classrooms, using it as a lesson in respect and history. Parents watched with their children, explaining the meaning of service, of courage, of what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. Crockett's message was no longer about a single senator's arrogance, it was about America's conscience. Even those who didn't agree with her politics couldn't ignore the moral clarity of her words. She had pierced through the noise of partisanship with something undeniable: truth. It was a truth written decades ago by a young man in a war zone, sealed in an envelope, and delivered through his daughter's steady voice. For Crockett, it was deeply personal. She had carried that letter for years, tucked safely away, a reminder of her father's sacrifice and her family's resilience. Sharing it was never about scoring political points, it was about honoring him, and by extension, every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. This letter wasn't meant for the Senate, she later said, but maybe it needed to be read there. That sentiment resonated everywhere. In a time when politics felt fractured, her message united people in a shared reverence for sacrifice. News outlets called it a moment of humanity. Editorials praised her composure, noting how she brought dignity back into a space too often defined by insults and division. And as the days passed, the moment didn't fade. It became a rallying cry, a reminder that respect is owed, not optional. Crockett's choice to respond not with anger but with history became a model of strength. She had shown that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes, it only needs to be spoken with grace. The Senate chamber would host many debates after that day, but the image of Crockett holding that letter lingered. Her father's words echoed beyond marble walls, carried into living rooms and schools, inspiring conversations about service, sacrifice, and what kind of nation America wanted to be. And that's why this moment will be remembered for years to come. The clip of Tommy Tuberville laughing and Jasmine Crockett calmly answering with her father's Vietnam letter became more than a viral moment. It became a symbol. In a world saturated with soundbites and outrage, one woman's composure silenced a room and reminded millions of what true service looks like. That letter, worn and creased, carried a weight that arrogance could not laugh away. It was history speaking through her voice, echoing louder than mockery, cutting through the noise with grace. Crockett's stand wasn't just a political triumph, it was a tribute, to her father, to every soldier who fought for freedoms often taken for granted, and to the families who carry their sacrifices quietly. In an era where shouting dominates headlines, she showed that dignity speaks louder than laughter. She turned a moment of ridicule into a powerful lesson, one that resonated far beyond Capitol Hill, sparking conversations about respect, patriotism, and leadership. For those watching, it wasn't just a debate, it was a mirror held up to a nation, asking whether we honor sacrifice or mock it, whether we choose arrogance or empathy. And that's why this story matters. It reminds us that leadership isn't about dominance, it's about courage, humility, and truth. If this moment moved you, share it. Tell your friends, your family, your community. Let Crockett's message ripple further than that chamber, further than this headline, because it deserves to live beyond this clip. Subscribe, not just to see more stories like this, but to be part of a movement that values truth over theatrics, dignity over derision. The letter may now be back in its envelope, but its message lives on. And together, we can make sure it continues to speak, louder than laughter, for years to come.